Good afternoon, good evening, what time of day it is, wherever you are right now. Thank you for tuning in to the Conversations with Dr. Don show. The show is produced and broadcast from the Portland, Oregon area. And for your first-time viewers, Conversations with Dr. Don is an ongoing series of one-hour standalone talk shows where I interview interesting people like most of you out there about who they are and about what we've decided to talk about tonight. Tonight we'll be talking about Chinese detective novels with Jeffrey Kinkley. Chinese detective novels with Jeffrey Kinkley, who is my guest. Jeffrey, good to see
you, Dr. Don.
I'm fine. How are you doing?
Just great, thank you.
How many years ago were you on?
Oh,
a number of time, huh?
5 years at least, I would think.
Yeah, you were great then.
Thank you.
But you're going to be great tonight again?
I hope so. I'll blame it on you if I'm not.
Okay. Yeah, so shall we do the first half of the show, which is about bio stuff?
Okay.
So the guests can get an idea who you are because they don't remember that many years going by. And then we'll go into the main part of the show, Chinese detective novels with you, Jeff Kinkley. All right, so shall we start off with some of these questions you've had before, but it's been so many years that the audience doesn't probably remember what your response was at the time. So if I would ask your best friend, who is Jeffy or Jeffrey? What would your best friend say?
My best friends call me Jeff.
Jeff, okay. What would your best friend say? Be your best friend. Jeff is first person. I gotcha, okay.
I'm a retired
Not
history
I'm,
professor.
Jeff is.
Oh, Jeff is. Oh, not in first person. Jeff is a retired professor of Chinese history and literature.
Uh-huh. And what else would your best friend say about you? Because he likes you a lot. Oh,
Jeff doesn't keep in touch with me often enough.
Uh-huh. Okay. And when and where were you born?
In Champaign-Urbana, Illinois.
Ah, Illinois, okay. Why were you born?
Maybe we'll find out. This is a session about mysteries.
Yeah. Okay. Got an answer? Why were you born?
Why was I born? No particular reason. We'd have to ask my parents, but they're deceased, so.
Okay. And anything significant about your racial, national, or cultural heritage other than your Chinese ancestry that you dug up somewhere?
No, I have no Chinese ancestry, although at my age, China has been a large part of my life.
Uh-huh. Any religious preference?
I'm sort of a generic Protestant.
Generic Protestant. Have you always been a generic Protestant?
Yes, my father was born on a farm in Ohio, and he went to the church, which was a Methodist church. And in Champaign, we continue to go to the Methodist church. And I'm not much of a churchgoer now, though. Sort of a secular person of Christian ethics, I like to think of myself as, anyway.
Yeah, Christian. Oh, so, okay. Are you secular? And your education. We've only got 2 hours about your education, so give us a little bit about your education. I'm really impressed with how you've studied for so long. And how many years were you in the university, the last one?
Well,
as a professor.
Oh, as a professor. Well, first I went to the University of Chicago for college,
yes,
where they taught Chinese as a dead language. Then I went to the University of Michigan, where they straightened out my pronunciation a little bit. Those were the days in the 60s and 70s when we hadn't established relations with China. So then I was at Harvard for my PhD. That was 8 years. I counted every one. I stayed on for a couple of years as a lecturer, and then got my permanent job at St. John's University in the borough of Queens, New York City. And I was there for 36 years before I retired.
36 years. They put
John's.
up with you for that length of time?
Yeah. I used to commute 6 hours round trip on the trains, but it was all trains. And St. John's is, if you look out from the law school, you can actually on a clear day see Manhattan and some of the skyscrapers. or at least from a drone above the law school. In the opposite direction, then within 1 or 2 miles, as the crow flies, are both childhood homes of Donald, son of Fred. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. Know what I mean, cinnamon.
No swearing on the show. Donald Trumper.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's a cultist, you know.
Mm.
So, and we know what you did in your working life, earning a living, and you really loved that, didn't you?
I loved it. Oh, yes, very much. I got to travel to China sometimes. My first, I originally had my deep immersion in Chinese culture and language in Taiwan in 1973-74 at a place called the Stanford Center in Taiwan. And
The Stanford Center in Taiwan. Okay.
yeah, it was attached. They used to get books actually from the mainland, the communist country, through a U.S. Army post office box. And we had special teachers who would come in with us. They had to be registered with the nationalist government, politically approved. We could not take any books out. And it was an interesting experience.
I'll betcha.
Then my first trip to the mainland was in 1980. Basically, although the French and Canadians and so forth could go to China in the 1970s, and some were even earlier if they were socialists or communists, the first Americans went there in 1979 after the opening up of diplomatic relations. And so I was sort of the second class in 1980. The American social scientists and humanists like me who went to China to study with the experts there were kind of negotiated according to quotas, which allowed a certain number of government-sponsored Chinese students who were mostly in the sciences to come to the U.S. So that's why we kind of we were like a little class of people who went over at that time.
You didn't decide to become a Taiwanese, did you?
No. It was tempting. It's a nice place.
Yeah. And since you retired, how many years have you been here since you retired?
About 5 years.
5 years, my gosh. So what have you been doing in your retirement?
Well, I've been continuing my research. I have an honorary relationship with Portland State now.
Portland State University, huh?
Yeah, what they call a courtesy professorship. I am retired from teaching, but I give the occasional lecture, and I can use their emails to log on to e-books online at home and so forth. So that's what's in it for me. You want to hear why I came back to Portland?
No, yes. Please.
I married my childhood sweetheart 10 years ago.
I married you. The two of you.
You
Remember that?
were
I
the
came
minister.
back there. Son of a gun.
Yeah, hard to believe. All these things come together. So she was my childhood sweetheart.
Yes.
We
I
were each
remember
other's
this.
first dates in 1962 in Champaign-Urbana.
And what's her name?
Susan
Susan?
Corliss in those days.
Will you say something to her right now? Are we?
Hi, Susie. Still love you. And so we hadn't seen each other for over 40 years, but I invited her to a class reunion. Things went pretty well. Ultimately, we married. I had gone east to have a career in New York, metropolitan New York. She went west to have a career with Intel in Chandler, Arizona, and I guess Hillsboro. So she had a little house in Beaverton, and I said, well, if you'll stick it out with me here in Joycey as I make my 6-hour round trip commutes to Manhattan and on out the other side, if you can put up with staying here, I'll come back and live in your little house in Beaverton.
You're so weird. 6-hour
Weird.
round trip commute.
But on the trains, you can read and be absolutely prepared for class after 3 hours.
Yeah, I betcha. Yeah. How about children?
I have one child who's 26 now.
26. How the time flies, huh? How's he doing?
He's fine. He went into health information management, and he is employed now in New Jersey.
Okay.
And speaks some Mandarin and goes to Taiwan sometimes.
How often do you see each other?
Oh, a couple times a year.
That's wonderful, huh?
Wish it were more. Too bad I'm trying to get him to move out to Portland, but then I'm trying to get all of my friends to move out here. I don't tell
No,
them
we don't
about
want
the
too many
rain.
to come here. No, that's from California. But come here. Anyhow, your political persuasion, dare you say whether you're a Trumpster or not?
Oh, no.
Left, center, or right, or what?
I'm a pretty standard, old-style liberal, I think you'd say.
Okay. And the difference between sympathy and empathy, the difference between those two. That's a flavoring of my old psychology.
I know. I
training.
think I got all of my thoughts about it from you, Don. Well, we can sympathize with people as when we see, for instance, these days, the homeless or all these people who are suffering from all these natural disasters. To empathize with them, though, means to really be able to put yourself in their shoes and feel what they feel.
And feel it in your bod, huh?
Yeah.
Not just your mind.
Pretty hard.
You betcha. Yeah, we need more of that.
A lot of people need more of that, including me.
Any memberships in political, social, or civic organizations that the viewers may be interested?
Well, here in the Portland area, actually, when I first came here, I got involved in the Northwest China Council, which puts on all sorts of programs to educate the public in Chinese affairs. In fact, it was spun off from the Asia Society in Manhattan and the World Affairs Council. Now it's called World Oregon, and it's the last of the regional councils still standing in the United States, I do believe. Then I also joined the Portland Suzhou Sister City Association, which was instrumental in building, getting workmen to come over from Suzhou, China, to build that wonderful Lansu Chinese garden in downtown Portland. And they have activities too, exchange activities. Not so easy in these days, of course, but those are some of the...
You have membership cards in all those organizations?
Yeah. They charge dues, so they give out cards.
Yeah.
But modest dues. I recommend the Lansu Chinese Garden in particular is a good place of respite right there in the middle of
Portland,
a part of Portland.
Yeah, I've been there. What's so beautiful about it, I think, is it seems like when I approach the open gate or whatever it is, I suddenly feel very tranquil and peaceful.
The
It's hard to
architecture is
describe.
authentic, built from plans. I mean, there are quite a few Chinese gardens now that have been built by Chinese architects, and Suzhou was one of the main centers of Chinese gardens, even in China. That's Portland's sister city. And the trees are interesting. They hire a full-time horticulturalist and bring in authentic trees. And when ceremonies are exchanged between Portland and Suzhou, which is to the west of Shanghai, you can almost... Suzhou now is a tremendously large city. Originally, 25 years ago, or 35 years ago, when you had sister city relations, Suzhou and Portland were about the same size. Now, Suzhou is kind of like Shanghai West, as that big megalopolis keeps expanding. So a lot of manufacturing, and Nike has one of its logistics centers there and everything. So whenever we have ceremonies, quite often the planting of roses, planting of native trees is part of the ceremony.
When you go to China, do you go to the gardens like you do here in Portland and have something happening to you, your feeling-wise, or like I was describing earlier when I go to the Chinese gardens here in Portland? It seems like I go tranquil. There's something that slows me down. You know
Well,
what I'm
whenever
talking about?
anybody goes to Suzhou or Hangzhou or some of those places, they definitely should go to the gardens. You're really missing out if you don't go there. Today, unfortunately, from one point of view, of course, it's wonderful that China has all this hyper development of skyscrapers and standards of living for a large section of the population. The non-rural section is really going up. But on the other hand, Chinese cities in some way are looking more and more alike because of all the construction, all the skyscrapers and so forth. So you have to kind of hunt out the little places where the native living places still exist. And for the sake of tourism, China now sometimes rebuilds neighborhoods into, actually I think they sometimes refer to them in English as Chinatowns. by which they mean they build these old style buildings that they think tourists want to see, that have a certain architectural authenticity, but they aren't original, and there's a kind of gloss over them and a commercial flavor that
Yes.
really doesn't fit what most historians anyway think of as the real China.
And these new buildings have anything to do with the Three Gorges Dam?
Oh, the Three Gorges Dam, well, that was built, 20 years ago, just about. That has
So many people
submerged.
were displaced, huh?
They were. That's quite a bit upstream from Shanghai, though. So
Yes.
and Suzhou. So there was lots of problems there. One part of China that I particularly like is the western part of Hunan province, where they have some national minorities called, in Chinese they call them the Miao people. In America we usually call them the Hmong, H-M-O-N-G.
Yeah.
Although the ones who live there actually are not, they don't call themselves Hmong, they call themselves Xiong. And it's usually spelled X-O-N-G-B. And they have colorful traditions that are not really the same as those of the majority of Chinese people. So that's one part of China that I've been to that is perhaps the special part of my China experience, going there to West Hunan. But again, it is very much caught in the throes of remaking the place for tourists now, and that's kind of sad. You can go into a Miao village and they have ceremonies for you, sort of like in the old days you used to go to the Grand Canyon and they would stage dances of the American Indians, the native peoples and stuff, and
Yeah.
it was clearly done for the spectators rather than for the original meaning of the dances. And that's something that's happening all over China. But I suppose that's better than what's happening in Xinjiang for the Uyghurs, that are now in the concentration camps.
Yeah.
So
what's going to be happening to China in the next 20 years, for example? Is it going capitalist, more capitalist than it is socialist or communist or what?
well, nobody
hard
can
to
predict
say.
the
It's a
future.
mixture.
And China is at a crossroads, as is the U.S. What happens this year in our elections will probably have a big influence on our future. In China, I think in the early period, which I call the first honeymoon, after the death of Mao and Deng Xiaoping came to power in 1978, and China began to open up, the Communist Party restrictions on individual freedom were not so great. There was a lot of investment from capitalistic countries like the United States, Japan, and Taiwan and so forth. Then, of course, there was the Tiananmen incident in 1989. That massacre almost led to a break in diplomatic relations between China and a lot of the Western countries and between China and Japan. Then I think of the period after that as sort of a second honeymoon, a period when people began to think, well, China is developing so fast economically with the same kind of giant manufacturing plants with modern machinery, appealing to capitalist markets in the same way, often with the same companies like Nike and the automobile companies that we have here in the West and Europe and so forth. People began to think, well, it's inevitable that China will become more democratic, more open, and that there will be a community of interest between China and the United States and other countries regarding international relations. I think that second honeymoon is probably over now, particularly the last 10 years or so with the new leader of China, Xi Jinping. He's been increasing Chinese Communist Party rule. There's less academic freedom in the schools. People are a little more uptight about breaking laws. They have this new social credit system. People really don't know what the future holds. Right now, there's a question because the economy is not doing so well. I mean, it was inevitable. The breakneck growth of China was not going to go on forever. But it's a question. Things have been tightening up. and even the capitalistic private sector of China has been reined in to a degree that it was not, say, 10 or 15 years ago. The state-owned factories are becoming more important, strategic factories. And of course, there's a relative outward projection of military force, as in the South China Sea. So I don't think anybody can expect that China will become either capitalistic or democratic like Western nations, for all the good things and all the bad things now that we see about how our capitalism has led to an increase in wealth inequality, an increase in control at the top, bad jobs, control of workers, things like that. We don't really know the ultimate meaning of capitalism ourselves. We don't know what the end point is there. So the direction of China, and I think our own Western world, is very much in flux at this point.
Very much in flux, yeah. All right. I have some more questions along those lines, but we better move on.
Okay.
Move along, okay?
Good.
Any persons from the past or alive today that you particularly look up to or admire from the past or alive today? Any heroes you have?
I got interested in politics at an early age, so I liked Adlai Stevenson and John F. Kennedy and people like that.
That's your liberal credentials.
Yeah.
Real liberal.
They have been found to have had certain flaws in the years since.
Sure.
Heroes today, hard to think of anything. Nobody is perfect. Our religious institutions, I mean, Mother Teresa is good, but we don't have that many people in the religions. The religions have kind of gone haywire lately, I think, joined their forces with nationalism in many cases, as in India, where the country was democratic. India has its problems too. It's becoming more and more interested in becoming a pure Hindu nation, despite the minorities.
Yes.
So
what's happening with Hong Kong?
Oh, well, I can't pretend to understand that. I am quite surprised that the People's Republic has allowed Hong Kong to continue the demonstrations up until now without cracking down. It's a great loss of face for the leader of China, Xi Jinping. And, in a way, I wish that some of the violence of the protesters had not developed to this degree, because I think it hurts their cause. But the very fact that they've been able to hold out against government repression and hold up to the world a mirror of police brutality as it exists there, under direction from Beijing, shows a kind of stark contrast between freedom and authoritarianism that grows stronger by the day. I worry very much about Hong Kong. I imagine the economy is not doing very well now. It's been a very bad place to live, for poor people for some time because of the housing crisis and that sort of thing. I think young people don't feel they have much of a future.
That was my last question now. What about homelessness in Hong Kong and in all of China? Are there any pockets of homelessness?
China has a lot of shanty towns. It's interesting, here in America, I haven't heard people revive the word Hooverville. I don't think even you are old enough to remember. You're a little bit older than I. Do you remember Hoovervilles? I remember it from my child textbooks. There are lots of migrant laborers, but problems with employment in China, certain recessionary aspects, I think, have put a brake on that. So some people have returned home. I'm thinking. For America, they say Finland has a good solution, and I don't see why it wouldn't be cheaper to devote our resources to things like building houses, providing the mental health services that people say are the reason for our gun violence, if that's what they really think. We don't spend either on collecting guns or on mental health in our country. So I think there are solutions to help these things.
What about the solutions that are being employed now in Spain successful socialism now.
I don't know that much about Spain. Maybe you can tell me about it.
No, I don't know that much either.
No.
But I had an article recently that I described in some detail
Ah.
about social justice, where it's applied across the board pretty much. And the end result is you have no evidence of denial of social justice, bottom line. And on my list of things to do, it's next to my computer, I'm going to do some more research on that too, because I'm always interested in social justice.
I'll have to look it up. It's interesting. Social justice now is becoming almost a negative term on the right wing of America. Like he's a social justice warrior, kind of like one of those words like snowflake or political correct. You know, that's political correctness in our vocabulary now usually refers to exaggerated forms of it, not what most of us would think would be, you know, don't be racist, don't insult Native Americans, et cetera, et cetera.
The terms we use, George Lakoff, remember George Lakoff? Yeah, framing. Yeah. And, let me stop and keep.
Okay.
Let's take a break here because we want to get into the main part.
All right.
Can you hear me now? Very good heavens, we got that fixed. Anyhow, we have had a break and now we're going to restart the show. Thanks for staying tuned. And for your viewers who missed the opening of the show, Conversations with Dr. Don is an ongoing series of 1-hour standalone talk shows where I interview interesting people like most of you out there about who they are as unique, one-of-a-kind individuals, and about what we've decided to talk about tonight. And we're talking about Chinese detective novels with Jeff Kinkley. Chinese detective novels with Jeff Kinkley. Welcome again.
Thank you, Don.
You've been delightful so far in the first half of the show. So let's talk about that. So you talked about, you wrote a book about mystery fiction that is written in China. Are there any updates, mystery books written in China? And now you're writing a new book about mysteries and thrillers set in China. That's a lot of writing, but not written or published there. Boy, that's a lot of mouthfuls there. Most are in English or French, I understand. Could you talk about your research and tell me about some of the authors? And are there any good translations from the Chinese? Take it away.
All right. The detective story was completely banned in China after the Communist Revolution. In other words, novels and short stories about crimes committed by people for individual selfish reasons. They did have spy stories, people who were basically trying to sabotage socialism, either for the KGB or the CIA or Taiwan, that sort of thing. But they didn't have detective stories.
Sabotaging socialism.
Right. In other words, the motive of every crime would be to defeat socialism and would have a political motive. Now, after China opened up in the 80s, you got a lot of really good detective stories, some with very interesting detective plots, others with wise judges who expose corruption. So I was interested in reading these things. They were all written in Chinese. Really, there's nothing, virtually nothing from that era that is translated into English.
And you can read Chinese.
Oh, yeah. So I went and I interviewed some of the authors, most of whom were police or had some connection to the security services. So what's the situation today? There's been a lot of water under the bridge, tightening up during the Tiananmen massacre, gradual relaxation, more tightening up again now. The Chinese are still writing lots of mystery novels. Many of them, as far as I can tell, are about serial killers, psychopaths, people with abnormal psychology. And another favorite topic is forensic medicine. That's another thing you can talk about.
Forensic medicine.
Yeah, a lot of forensic medical specialists have become mystery writers, where they use their skills to write a mystery.
Forensic, say that again. What's it mean, forensic?
Basically, somebody who does autopsies and pathological reports and so forth for the police
Okay.
to detect crime. So there are some now. Gang Shui Yin, A Devil's Mind. That's an example of that. Stories. These are things that are available in English, and sometimes very good translations. So,
who will read these?
people who are interested in mystery fiction. And you just have to be able to read English and follow the plot. So people who like a good plot and are not turned off by really abnormal, shall we say, Hannibal Lecter type of killers, they will like these things. One is Zhou Haohui, Valley of Terror. There's another one, The Untouched Case by Zijin Chun, Chen. Another is by a guy called Ai, called The Perfect Crime.
How can the viewers get copies of these?
They can just do a simple search on Amazon. And there are also another favorite genre, believe it or not, in China. Since a lot of people write fantasy novels online, they have mystery stories that have devils and ghosts and all sorts of specters and supernatural phenomena. One of these novels is also available. It's by a guy called Cai Jun, a bestseller in China. It's called The Child's Past Life. If you Google The Child's Past Life, you will find that. There are other people who've written what I think of as crossovers between these more generic novels and what we'd think of as serious, non-generic literature. Like, well, there are quite a few translations now by a lawyer who studied law at Northwestern Law School in Chicago, He Jiahong. That would be spelled H-E is the family name. And then the given name is Jiahong. And there are several of his novels that have been translated. Another good author is Wang Shuo. Playing for Thrills is a novel I would recommend. Another one by a guy called Yo Zhenyun. He's got a couple novels. One is called, oh gosh, what is it? The Apricot's Revenge. No, that's Sung Ying wrote Apricot's Revenge. And Yo Zhenyun has written a couple. Actually, the Nobel Prize winner of the year 2012, Mo Yan, actually has written a book that some people call a crime thriller, and that is called The Republic of Wine. So those are some of the things that are being written in China. A few of them, like the ones I mentioned, are available in English translation. But what really sells over here, and I think these are better written stories, are these other kinds of detective stories that are set in China. They look like Chinese mystery novels, but they're not written in China, and they're not publishable in China or published in China. I'll give you a test case. Here's the best-selling author. He's written, he's sold 2 million copies. Let me...
yes.
Okay. I thought you would appreciate Qiu, Q-I-U, Xiaolong, Xiaolong, means little dragon. He's got about 10 or 12 novels of these sorts with his detective Chun. He writes in English.
How many of those have you read?
Of these?
Yeah.
I've read all of them. He's got a new one coming out this year. It's called China, Hold Your Breath.
Are they really interesting?
Yeah, I think so.
Pardon me my English or American bias.
Well, there are two reasons for reading these mysteries.
Yes.
One is the ordinary reason anybody reads a mystery, for the suspense. It keeps the pot boiling. All sorts of unusual and dangerous situations occur. Occasionally chases and even fights, usually not gunfights, because there are very few guns in civilian hands in China. But there are lots of knives and machetes and that sort of thing. The other reason is to learn about China. And the interesting thing about the authors, Chou Xiaolong, for instance, he's one who was born in China, born and raised in China, and the regime does let him go back from time to time to refresh himself. There's another one like him, Diane Wei Liang, Liang. She also writes China mysteries, her Red Princess books. Princess is kind of Chinese slang for a well-connected young woman, somebody whose father is a high cadre in the regime. The other authors, I'll give you a list of some of them. They are former journalists, former students, consultants, business people. Some are lawyers who've done business in China. All sorts of. One guy did a lot of meditation in Tibet, evidently, once upon a time. There are people about my age. So I'll give you a few names that all started.
How much of the ordinary citizenry reads these novels?
Well, we know that 2 million people have read Chou Xiaolong's books alone. Most of these others, they have a worldwide audience. Once they write in English, then people like Chou Xiaolong, Diane Wei Liang, Elliot Patterson, Nicole Moniz, they've been translated into about 20 different languages, mostly European languages. There are quite a few detective stories. In French, they call them polar, policier. They're written in French that have not, for some reason, been translated into English. But France has its own strong detective story market. And one of the authors there, Michel Imbert, he has been translated into 20 languages. So quite a few people read these things.
I feel so dumb.
Well, not everybody thinks that a mystery is to his or her taste. But I was asking myself, how would I put these up to, Greg Iles or Tana French or the legal people like Scott Turow and John Grisham?
Yes.
I'd say they're at least an A- or B+. And as a professor who gives them extra credit for their information to China, I'd probably give some of them as an A.
Really?
Yeah, these are pretty good. When I read them, of course, I take notes because the plots are often very complicated. But there's some thrillers now. Already, this kind of writing began basically in the mid-90s and has continued to this day. And there are new authors that come on the stage from time to time. Actually, there are 3 of these authors who live in the Portland area. One is Nicole Moniz. She's one of the pioneers. Her novels are not so generic, but they have to do with China, and they usually have to do with missing objects or crime or something like that. And she's written some historical things too, and later became a food writer.
Do you have dual citizenship, Chinese and American?
Oh, no. Very few people have that.
Because your knowledge about China and
well, that comes mostly from book learning and a few trips. But let me mention the other 2 Portland authors.
Please.
Daniel Nie, Nieh. He has written the first of a trilogy called Beijing Payback about a young basketball player at California State System School who discovers his grocery store father actually has a criminal background, and that gets him into all sorts of hot water. Then there's a self-published book by Lee Barkman that's pretty good, Return of the Dragon. So we have 3 of these authors right here. That's about his student experiences teaching English. So you've got all sorts of people with all sorts of China experience writing these mysteries. And I can kind of identify because these people who were in China in the 80s, 90s, and beyond had some of the same experiences I did. Then you have some really good people. A lot of them were born in Britain, actually, these good writers. John Gapper and, what's his name, Ian Hamilton, who's actually a Canadian. And what was another one I was going to mention?
These Chinese
James
writers?
Brooks. These people really can write. And they give you Chinese detail, but they don't overdo it.
So they're writing about Chinese
Yeah,
characters and
oftentimes,
situations. And
oftentimes the hero is a Chinese cop because they have very few private investigators in China. They're practically illegal. They have to call themselves something else. There are a couple such people. Actually, Catherine Sampson, another Brit, wrote a couple of very good novels with a journalist paired up with a Chinese PI. Of course, they're always getting into trouble. So usually the hero is a Chinese cop, an ex-Chinese cop. Sometimes it's a foreigner who finds him or herself on the wrong side of the law, like Lisa Brockman. She's written some good ones. What are some good ones of hers? I got a list here. So many that Rock, Paper, Tiger is one of hers. So you can learn about China, be treated to a good mystery. Many of these things, you just can't put them down. All the authors have spent months or in most cases years in China. There are some places, for instance, there's Tom Clancy and the fellow who took over for him, they have a China thriller, a one-off novel. And they're these kind of things these one-off novels are pretty well researched. But these people, they really know what they're talking about.
And they can lock you right in once you get page turning, and there you go. Right
Yeah,
away.
yeah. And of course, there are all sorts of cross-cultural relationships because sometimes the kind of crimes are international crimes. The kind of people get out of the newspaper, like smuggling or people smuggling or terrorism, making up bad counterfeit products that kill people, denying the existence of an epidemic, that kind of stuff that gets into the news and so forth. So then you get international angles to these plots, and foreign investigators come over. Peter May, for instance, has a female, although he's Scottish, now living in France, he's one of the mystery writers who's won an award. He has an American female forensic investigator who comes over and naturally collaborates with a Chinese cop. Mm-hmm. People from abroad can't just go around investigating murders. In fact, one of the unrealistic things about these novels is, of course, Chinese cops don't have that much discretion. They take orders from above. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the things that the authors try to work with. How do you try to solve a mystery or achieve justice in an authoritarian atmosphere?
How about censorship from on high?
Oh, yeah.
For all these writers.
Well, for instance, our number one man, Cho Xiaolong, he provides sort of a test case. His Inspector Chun novels were so popular that people in China thought, well, let's translate them into Chinese. Now remember, he's one who writes these novels in English to begin with. There are others who are non-generic writers like Ha Jin and Guo Xiaolu and Li Yiyun and so forth. These are generic detective novels. So they were translated into Chinese.
Translated into Chinese.
There was so much censorship, he said, let's just call the whole thing off. Mm. Like half of a whole chapter was censored. One of the more amusing things that actually didn't affect just him, but other people too, where do you locate the crime and the police thing?
Yeah.
You get local officials protesting against it. So an interesting example is this novel I mentioned that was written in Chinese to begin with by Zhou Haohui, Z-H-O-U, published by Penguin. It's very highly touted, lots of publicity for it. Originally, it was written in Chinese, and the author, being from the Yangzhou area in Jiangsu province, mm-hmm. down near Shanghai, mm-hmm. Wanted, the local color to reflect the kind of society that he was aware of from his childhood. Mm-hmm. But because of the
Physical
provincial
locations.
officials, he had to make it more vague, and he couldn't even give any name to the town where it occurred. He called it X city. Actually, he called it a city.
Is it censorship?
In other words, that's self-censorship in advance. But what's interesting is when the novel came to America, he suffered from the whipsaw of socialism and capitalism. The editor of the book said, well, let's add back some local color. But let's not make the crime occur in Yangzhou, where the author originally wanted. Let's put it in somewhere in Sichuan. Why?
Oh, Sichuan.
Because people know Sichuan cooking, with its spicy pepper cooking, and the giant pandas. So that's where the crime takes place. So that author took it from both sides. And I don't know if you're familiar with the most famous science fiction novel, The Three-Body Problem, by Liu Cixin.
No.
It's the one that was read by President Obama. Evidently, he read all 3 volumes while president.
Really?
I guess on his night bedstand. He must be a speed reader. Michiko Kakutani of the New York Times interviewed him. And
How many novels has Trump read?
don't get me started. Or don't. We can't start, can we?
Sure, of course.
Incidentally, Hooverville should be Trumpville's, right?
Yes.
Okay. So, Liu Cixin, you can read him in Chinese, the original language, or you can read him in really superb English translations from Ken Liu, L-I-U, who's not only a good translator, but he writes original science fiction in English. I'm not sure what his native language is. Anyway, he's native in English. So they asked Liu Cixin, would you prefer people who are bilingual to read your novels in the original Chinese? He said, no. I'd rather you'd read them in the English translation. They fulfill some of my original expectations better than what I was able to put down in Chinese. So that gives you a little clue as to why I'm kind of interested now in Chinese detective novels that were not published in China.
In the 21st century and all the electronics and 5G and computers and that sort of a thing, are books going to be obsolete?
Ooh. Well, all I can tell you is what's happened so far is that online books are rife, in China as in here. One of the interesting things I learned when I began to look more widely into the question of genre fiction. Science fiction really is the king of genre fiction now, like the three-body problem that Obama likes so much. Science fiction allows you to pretend that you're talking about the future when you're actually talking about social problems that have existed, that already exist today.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, several of the bestsellers in Chinese mystery novels in the PRC are translations of Japanese mystery stories. Mm-hmm. Now, for one thing, the Japanese have a lot of good mystery writers. Higashino Keigo, I guess, is the name of one of them, who has, I think, this was a few years ago. And of course, what's a bestseller and what isn't is always a hard thing to tell. But as far as anybody can tell, he had about 3 novels on PRC bestseller lists when they didn't have any real ones by Chinese authors.
How about your writings?
Oh,
Yeah,
only academics read my books. Nobody would read mine. That's the trouble with the humanities, as you know, are pretty much in crisis now.
Yes.
Even having professorial positions is a difficult position. But anyway, I was going to continue talking about the online publishing.
Uh-huh.
There is so much fantasy fiction now, including, there are not only Chinese writers who write about Chinese wizards, they also write about European-style princesses and wizards, write them in Chinese. Some of these are then translated into English, which people read online. And there's a whole group of, as far as I can tell, non-Chinese ancestry, Americans, Canadians, Australians, English people who write martial arts novels with Asian characters or pseudo-Asian characters. And they write these things in English, and people read them. And sometimes they're published as hard copy books, as well as online. So there is a lot of this stuff out there that I don't know anybody is really studying. I mean, there are a few scholars who are studying it. Heather Inwood of England is studying these things, but almost nobody else. So, but you know, that's, as I say, there are people who evidently like to read Chinese detective stories that are translated in English that have ghosts and devils in them. In fact, China has at least one novel that has vampires and werewolves in it. And a few years ago, one of their games that they had was role-playing of werewolves, Western-style werewolves, or Eastern European-style werewolves. I don't know. They're not part of my cultural heritage, really, but maybe some of your viewers have werewolves in their, I hesitate, ancestry, but their cultural ancestry. So sometimes culture, if you want to call it that, low culture has no borders.
Well, we're getting down to the last 3 or 4 minutes or so, and it's been an interesting discussion with me doing the listening for the most part, and you're always delightful to hang out with. But look at that camera and talk to the viewers about anything that you've talked about so far or anything else, and you have about 3 or 4 minutes, so just go off and wing it.
Okay. Well, I'd like to get people interested in my other major research project.
Yes.
This is high literature. One of my favorite authors, who can also be read in English, is an author called Shen Songwan. Actually, I translated this book. You can get it, Border Town. The spelling of the author's name is Shen Congwen. He would have got the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1988 if he had not passed away earlier in that year. Usually they announce the prize in October, I think. We know that he would have got the prize because one of the Swedes on the literature committee, Göran Malmqvist, kind of broke the code of silence and said that he would have got it. And, you know, a couple of years ago they had this sex and money scandal on the literature committee of the Nobel Prize organization. So other people have been breaking the code of silence. Another Swede, guy called, I don't know how to pronounce Swedish, Kjell Espmark, said, yeah, Shen Songwan would have got the thing. But there are several, besides Border Town, there is Imperfect Paradise and some other things. If you look him up, I hope that'll be my next research project. I want to go back to Shen Songwan. His complete works have come out now in Chinese, and so I can read them. It was kind of my good luck that when I started my career...
Do you ever sleep?
But you see, my secret was when I started studying the works of Shen Songwan, he was banned on both sides of the Taiwan Strait, both in mainland China and Taiwan. So I was able to interview the man before he died. And
you are quite a character, you know that in your own right.
It's been fun.
Yeah, and what's this other one here?
Oh, this is my latest book, Visions of Dystopia in China's New Historical Novels. This is interesting. I'll mention this. This is an academic book from Columbia University Press. Most of my others are published by Stanford. I don't think many of your viewers would be interested, but if they can get the table of contents on Amazon.com, you know, where they give you the first few pages, it gives a list of historical novelists who write very well. They've been translated into Chinese in most cases, particularly since I finished this book a few years ago. And you can read these things. Some of the authors, Mo Yan, Li Rui, Wang Anyi, Su Tong, Liu Zhenyun, whom I mentioned previously. You can get their names from this book, and then you can Google them or do a search on Amazon.com, and you can get their novels. Really worth it. They're historical in the not in a straight historical sense, but they use magical realism. In fact, one of the great influences was Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude. They liked that sort of thing. It gave them lots of inspiration. So did Latin America in general to write historical novels, taking advantage of the vast landscape of China and all the tragedies it had undergone, all the forgetting and re-remembering and forgetting again and re-remembering. This really hit a chord with the Chinese people. And so these talented authors like Mo Yin started writing historical novels that kind of gave their take on what is the direction of China in my lifetime. Most of them are about the same generation as me, or a little younger, the Red Guard generation, people who were sent down to the countryside. So they had a spatial take on society that younger people who think maybe China has always had bullet trains and skyscrapers. Not in those days.
I want to go back to the 20th century. Well, it's been delightful.
It has indeed. Thank you very much.
And I got a couple of public service announcements to make to be sure that we didn't leave anything out. To learn about the nation, that's one of the oldest left-wing publications in America. Go to www.thenation.org. And to learn more about the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, without the ACLU, our civil liberties would be completely down the tubes. Go to that website to learn more about the Alliance for Democracy. That's a great organization. Go to the national website at the alliancefordemocracy.org, the Portland, Oregon website at www.afd-pdx.org to learn more about America and learn how to end corporate personhood. Oh, we've got to end corporate personhood in America. And go to movetoamend.org. And thanks for watching. I'm so glad you're watching. Remember, KFC, not Kentucky Fried Chicken, Dr. Don's KFC. Kind, friendly, and charitable. Be kind, be friendly, and be charitable. To you too, and you too, and you too. Yeah.
And if you need someone to marry you, go to Dr. Don.